The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Walter Townsend stepped through the gate of the Harlan County Livestock Fair, and every single person in that dusty, sun-baked yard could have told you the moment he arrived, not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because the silence he carried with him moved through the crowd like a cool breath of wind on a scorching August afternoon in 1882. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, lean in the way that men who worked honest land tend to be lean, with hands that were roughened by years of fence mending and hay baling and early mornings that started long before the sun thought about rising over the Kansas flatlands. He wore a hat the color of good tobacco, tilted just enough to shade his eyes, and those eyes were the kind of gray-green that changed depending on the light, like shallow river water over pale stones. He did not speak to the men near the gate. He did not shake hands or slap backs the way most of the ranchers did when they came to the fair in Cimarron, Kansas, in the summer of that year. He simply moved through the crowd with a quiet, deliberate purpose, and he found himself a spot along the railing of the main auction pen, and he folded his arms across the fence post, and he waited. The livestock fair at Cimarron in the summer of 1882 was not a modest affair. Gray County had been growing steadily since the railroad had pushed its iron fingers out along the Arkansas River, and the cattle trade that had once depended entirely on the long drives north from Texas was now supplemented by local ranching operations that were building themselves up into something permanent and proud. The fair was held on the wide, flat stretch of ground just east of the main street, where the smell of horses and cattle and fresh sawdust mingled with the aroma of fry bread and roasted corn that the women sold from their wagon beds along the fence line. There were perhaps 200 people gathered on that particular Saturday morning, ranchers and farmhands and merchants from town, families who had ridden in from homesteads scattered across the flat prairie, and a handful of strangers who had come down from Dodge City to see what the southern range had to offer. Walter Townsend had driven his wagon 22 miles to be there that morning. He had left before dawn, before the coffee had even finished boiling, and he had let his old bay horse set the pace along the dirt road that cut through the switchgrass and the sage. He had a particular purpose in mind. He had come to bid on a breeding pair of shorthorn cattle that old Hector Pruitt was selling off, because his operation, a 200-acre spread called Townsend Flat that sat along a tributary of the Cimarron River, needed strong stock if it was going to grow the way he intended it to grow. That was the reason he had put in his ledger. That was the reason he had written down in the margin of his account book, next to the figures that told him what he could spend and what he could not. But Walter Townsend was not the kind of man who lied well, even to himself, and if he had been honest about the full weight of why he had driven 22 miles before sunrise, he would have had to admit that he had also heard, from his neighbor Amos Gilchrist, that Della Holloway was going to be at the fair. He had heard her name for the first time 3 months earlier, in the spring, when the snow had finally given up its hold on the ground, and the mud season had turned the roads into rivers of brown slick. Amos had mentioned her in passing, the way men in small communities mention women they consider to be of particular note, which was not with anything improper, but with the kind of careful, respectful observation that said this is someone worth knowing about. She was the daughter of Thomas Holloway, who had died the previous November of a sudden fever that had taken him in less than a week, leaving behind a homestead of 160 acres northeast of Cimarron, a small herd of mixed cattle, 2 mules, a debt to the cattlemen's bank in town, and his only child, Della, who was 26 years old and by all accounts completely alone in managing it all. Walter had not said much when Amos told him this. He had nodded and looked out at the field he had been mending fences along, and he had thought about it in the way that he thought about most things, which was slowly and thoroughly, and with a kind of careful respect for the weight of what he was considering. He had not gone out of his way to seek her out after that. He was not a man who pushed himself into places where he had not been invited. But she had settled into his mind the way a particular song settles in, the kind you cannot quite name but keep finding yourself humming when you are doing something else entirely. He had heard a few more things about her over the weeks that followed. She was managing the homestead herself with the help of a hired hand, an older Mexican man named Rodrigo who had worked for her father for many years. She had negotiated with the bank herself, which was not a small thing for a woman in 1882, when women were expected to defer such matters to fathers or brothers or husbands, and she had no father anymore and no brothers and certainly no husband. She had apparently walked into the cattlemen's bank on a Tuesday morning in January, with the ground frozen solid outside and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she had sat down across from the bank president, a man named Chester Aldrich who was known for his firm and not always generous handling of overdue accounts, and she had laid out a repayment plan that was detailed enough and reasonable enough that Aldrich had actually agreed to it. The story had made its way around the county the way good stories do, quietly and with admiration, because people out on the Kansas prairie knew what it cost a person to hold something together when everything around them was trying to come apart. And then Walter had seen her, just once from a distance, at the dry goods store in Cimarron in late April, when he had come in for nails and flour and she had been there purchasing seed. He had not spoken to her. He had barely been close enough to see her clearly, but he had seen enough. She was not tall, but she carried herself in a way that made her seem more present than her height suggested, as if she occupied her space in the world with complete confidence and did not intend to apologize for any of it. She had dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her dress was practical, the kind of dress a woman wears when she has real work to do, not the kind designed for standing and being admired. Her face, when she had turned slightly to speak to the storekeeper, had been composed and direct, with a kind of seriousness in it that Walter recognized immediately because he carried something similar himself. He had walked out of that store with his nails and his flour, and he had driven home 22 miles, and he had thought about her for the next 3 months. So when Amos had mentioned, 2 weeks ago, that Della Holloway was planning to attend the Cimarron Livestock Fair to sell 2 of her steers and look into purchasing a new mule to replace one that had gone lame in the spring, Walter had gone back to his ledger and looked at his figures again, and then he had decided that yes, he did very much need those shorthorn cattle from Hector Pruitt, and yes, the fair was definitely the right place to find them. The auction was not scheduled to begin until 10 in the morning, and it was not yet 9 when Walter arrived, which gave the fair a full hour to go on being a fair before it became a serious thing. He stayed at the railing and watched people move and listened to the sounds of the animals in the pens, and he was aware, in the way he had trained himself to be aware of things he cared about without appearing to be looking for them, of every person who came through the main gate. She arrived at 10 minutes past 9. He knew it was her before he had a clear view of her face, because she walked the same way she had in the dry goods store, with that particular directness that was all her own, and she was leading a mule on a rope and walking beside a tall, wiry older man who he took to be Rodrigo, and behind them came a young boy of perhaps 12 or 13 who was clearly there to help with the animals. She had on a blue calico dress today, not the dark practical one he had seen in April, and her hat was the same wide-brimmed one, and she was talking to Rodrigo in what appeared to be a focused and businesslike manner as she came through the gate, her eyes moving over the fair with quick, intelligent assessment. Walter turned his gaze back toward the auction pen and was very careful about not doing anything that could be described as staring. He would have told you if pressed, simply standing at a fence railing and being a person at a livestock fair. But his heart, which was generally a very sensible organ that he kept well under control, had picked up its pace in a way that he found mildly inconvenient and entirely understandable. The auction opened precisely at 10 with the auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Jim Draper who had been doing this work for 15 years and could read a crowd the way a good tracker reads ground, calling for bids on the first offering of the day, which was a pair of yearling mules that drew lively competition from 3 different ranchers. Walter watched and waited. He had memorized the order of the listings from the flyer that had been distributed in town the week before, and he knew that Hector Pruitt's Shorthorns were 7th on the list. And he knew, because he had looked, that Della Holloway's 2 steers were listed 9th. He bid on the Shorthorns when they came up, calmly and without drama, raising his hand in the understated way he did everything, and he secured them for a fair price that pleased him without depleting him. The other men around him had been more theatrical in their bidding, calling out numbers and slapping their hats against their thighs with competitive fervor, and Walter had simply raised his hand twice and won the pair, and Jim Draper had pointed his gavel at him and said, "Sold," to the quiet man in the tobacco hat, and a few people had laughed, and Walter had allowed himself a small smile and gone to settle the paperwork. He was back at the railing before the 9th listing came up, which was Della Holloway's steers, and this time there was more of the fair between him and the pen than before, because while he had been at the registration table, the crowd had shifted and spread, and he had to find a new position along the fence, which happened to put him approximately 15 feet from where Della Holloway was standing on the other side of the pen, watching the proceedings with her arms folded and her expression attentive. He had a clear view of her face now for the first time. She was pretty in the way that the Kansas prairie is pretty, not soft and decorative but honest and real, and the kind of thing that grows on you the longer you look at it, the kind of pretty that does not announce itself but simply is. She had dark eyes, nearly black in the bright morning light, and a firm jaw, and a mouth that was set with concentration right now, but had at its corners the ghost of something warmer. She was watching the steers in the pen the way a person watches something they have worked hard to produce, and are now entrusting to a stranger's judgment, which is to say, with a complicated mix of pride and worry. The bidding on her steers started at $12 a head and moved up quickly. There were 4 bidders, men from the northern part of the county, and they pushed the price to $17, and then to $19, and one by one they fell away until there were 2 left, and the 2 of them took it to $22 before one of them shook his head, and the other claimed the pair with a satisfied nod. Walter watched Della receive this news. She did not clap or cry or make any large display. She simply drew in one long breath, and her shoulders settled slightly, and she looked at the notebook she was holding in her hand and made a careful mark in it, and then she looked up and across the pen, and her eyes met his. It was not a long look. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which is not long at all in the conventional reckoning of time, but which can feel considerably longer when 2 people who have been orbiting each other's awareness without ever quite colliding finally find themselves looking directly at one another. Walter held her gaze steadily, because looking away suddenly would have been awkward, and also because he genuinely did not want to look away. And Della Holloway held his gaze for those 3 seconds with an expression that was impossible to fully read but which contained, at its edge, a note of frank curiosity that he found entirely encouraging. Then she looked back at her notebook, and Walter looked back at the pen, and the fair went on around them. He spent the next 40 minutes talking himself into doing something about this situation, which was not his natural inclination. He was not, by disposition, the kind of man who walked up to women at livestock fairs and introduced himself. He was the kind of man who thought about things carefully and then acted on them deliberately, and the thinking part of this particular situation was taking longer than he would have liked. He purchased a cup of coffee from a woman at a nearby wagon and drank it standing up and watched the remainder of the auction and tried to formulate something that was not completely awkward to say. The mule listing came up at noon, which was listed as the 12th item on the schedule, and Walter, who was keeping careful mental track of the order by this point for reasons that had nothing to do with livestock, positioned himself near the far end of the pen where the mule prospects were being walked for inspection, because he had worked out that this was where Della Holloway would most likely be evaluating her options. He was right. She arrived at the mule pen a few minutes before the listing was called, and she walked the length of the fence with a quiet, methodical focus, looking at the 4 mules that were on offer with the eye of someone who knew exactly what she needed and was not going to be persuaded by anything that did not meet that standard. The older mule dealer who was showing his stock tried to make a point of the biggest mule's size, and she listened to him politely, and then asked him 3 questions about the animal's temperament and hoof condition and history of work that clearly went well beyond what the dealer had expected. And he gave her answers that were somewhat flustered in their precision, and she thanked him and moved on to the next animal. Walter was watching the mules too, which was not actually a lie, because he knew good mule stock when he saw it, and the second animal in the line was a solidly built gray mule of about 7 years with clean legs and a sensible eye, and he would not have minded owning her himself. He waited until Della had finished her inspection of the 3rd mule and turned toward the 4th, and then he said, not loudly but clearly enough to be heard, "The second one is your best bet." She stopped and looked at him. Not with surprise exactly, but with the careful reassessing look of a person who has been spoken to by a stranger and is deciding in the space of about half a second whether this is someone worth engaging with. "Is it?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Gray coat, clean legs. She's been worked but not overworked. Look at the way she's standing. She's easy in herself. The big bay at the end has a slight off-4 issue that the dealer is hoping you won't notice." Della looked at him for another moment, and then she turned and looked back at the gray mule, and then at the bay at the end of the line, and she walked the full length of the pen again slowly, and Walter watched her do it, and when she came back she was looking at the gray mule. "You know mules," she said, which was not quite a compliment and not quite anything else, but which he took as a reasonable opening. "I know enough," he said. "Walter Townsend. I have a spread down along the south tributary Townsend Flat." She considered this. "Della Holloway," she said, "my operation is northeast, toward the Cimarron Bend." "I know," he said, and then immediately regretted saying it because it sounded the way it was, which was that he had been aware of who she was before this moment, and that was potentially strange, but she did not seem unsettled by it. She simply looked at him with that direct dark gaze and said, "You bid on the Shorthorns earlier." "I did," he said. "You barely made a sound," she said. "I nearly missed it." "I got what I came for," he said. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but had the same quality as one, a small warming around the eyes. "So did I," she said. "Thanks to the fair price on those steers." She paused. "I am going to bid on that gray mule." "I think that would be the right decision," he said. She bid on the gray mule when the listing opened, and she secured her in 4 clean bids, and the dealer looked somewhat put out by the efficiency of the whole transaction, which Walter found deeply satisfying. He stayed nearby without being intrusive, which required a certain amount of practiced casualness, and when the mule was hers and the registration papers were being sorted, he caught Rodrigo watching him with the sharp, assessing eyes of a man who has been responsible for someone's well-being for a long time and intends to continue being responsible. Walter gave Rodrigo a respectful nod. Rodrigo gave him back one that was slightly more conditional. The fair wound down through the afternoon in the way fairs do, gradually, and with the kind of pleasant, unfocused energy that settles over a crowd when the main business is done, and what remains is the pleasure of being gathered together. There was a fiddle player near the main gate who had been playing since mid-morning and showed no sign of stopping, and some people were dancing on the flat ground near the wagons, and the smell of the food vendors was stronger as the day wore on, and appetites reasserted themselves after the concentrated attention of the morning's business. Walter found himself in the company of Della Holloway again, not entirely by accident, at one of the food vendor wagons near the east fence, where a woman from one of the local farms was selling cold buttermilk and fresh cornbread. They arrived at approximately the same time from different directions, which was genuinely coincidental enough that neither of them had to pretend it was anything other than what it was. "Are you staying for the afternoon?" she asked him as they both accepted the paper-wrapped cornbread that the vendor handed them. "For a while," he said. "I need to arrange transport for the shorthorns. Prewitt's man is bringing them around later." He paused. "And you?" "Rodrigo is seeing to the paperwork on the mule," she said. "I have a little time." She looked at the cornbread in her hand and then looked out at the fair and said, with the directness that he was already beginning to understand was simply how she was, "You can walk with me if you want." He did want. He told her so, simply and without performance, and they walked together along the fence line of the fair with their cornbread and the afternoon sun angling long and golden across the Kansas flats, and they talked. They talked about the fair first, because that was where they were and it was comfortable and natural. She told him about the steer sale and what the money meant for the homestead, not in a way that exposed more than she intended, but in the frank, matter-of-fact way of a person who is not embarrassed by the reality of their situation and does not expect you to pretend it is something other than what it is. He listened in the way he did everything, with complete attention that was quiet and total, and she noticed it. He could tell she noticed it because her voice settled slightly as she went on, the way a voice does when it is responding to being genuinely heard. He told her about Townsend Flat, about the land that ran down to the tributary, and the way it flooded in wet years, and dried to cracked clay in dry ones, and was beautiful in both conditions if you had the disposition to appreciate what was actually in front of you rather than what you wished were there. He told her about the shorthorns he had just bought and what he planned to do with them, and she asked questions that were smart and grounded, the questions of someone who understood cattle operations from the inside rather than from the margins. "You've been running the place alone?" he asked her after they had been walking for a while and the conversation had moved past the comfortable preliminary things and into something a little more honest. "Since November," she said. "Rodrigo has been with us since before I can remember. He knows the cattle better than I do in some ways, but the decisions are mine now." She said it without self-pity or pride, just as a plain fact about the shape of her life. "That's a lot to carry," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "Are you going to tell me it's too much for a woman to manage?" she said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite sharpness but was a readiness for that particular conversation, the kind of readiness that comes from having had it many times before. "No," he said. "I'm going to say it's a lot for any person, which it is." She held his gaze for a moment with those dark, assessing eyes, and then something in her relaxed just slightly, like a door that had been closed being opened a crack to see what was on the other side. "It is," she said, "but it's mine. And I am going to keep it. I don't doubt that for a single minute," he said. The afternoon carried them through a circuit of the fair and into a conversation that ranged wider and further than either of them had quite intended. The way conversations do when two people discover that their minds work in similar ways, that they are interested in the same things and troubled by the same things, and that the silences between them when they came were comfortable rather than awkward. They talked about the land and the weather and the ways that Gray County was changing as more settlers came out from the east, pushing the open range into smaller and smaller corners. They talked about the railroad and what it was doing to the cattle trade, and she had opinions about this that were pointed and well-reasoned, and he disagreed with one of them and said so, and she argued back with a quickness and confidence that he found enormously appealing, and they were both laughing by the end of it in that particular way that happens when two people realize they can disagree without it meaning anything bad. He told her, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, when they had settled on a section of fence rail to eat the last of the cornbread and watch the remaining activity of the fair, that he had driven 22 miles that morning before sunrise to get here. He did not say why. He left that sitting in the air between them, and she looked at him with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely knowing, and she said, "That is a long way to come for a pair of shorthorns." "It is," he agreed. She looked away, out across the fair, but the corner of her mouth had done the thing that it did, the warming thing, and Walter Townsend felt the afternoon light on his face and thought that, whatever happened next, he was very glad he had gotten in that wagon before dawn and driven those 22 miles. Rodrigo came to collect her at 4 o'clock with the new mule in tow and the young boy at his heels, and Walter stood and shook the older man's hand with the same respect he would have given any man, and Rodrigo gave him back a handshake that was precisely firm enough to communicate that he was being evaluated, and the verdict was not yet in. Della gathered her things and looked at Walter with those direct dark eyes and said, "It was good to meet you, Mr. Townsend." "It was good to meet you, Miss Holloway," he said. And then, because he was a man who believed in doing what he intended to do and not leaving things undone that mattered, he said, "Would it be all right if I came to call?" In a proper way, on a proper occasion. She looked at him for a long moment. The fair moved and breathed around them, the fiddle player still going at the gate, the smell of the evening coming on in the cooling air. "Yes," she said, "it would be all right." She walked away with Rodrigo and the mule and the boy, and Walter watched her go without watching her go, which is a specific art. And then he turned and went to find Prewitt's man about his shorthorns, and he was smiling in the careful, interior way of a man who has no audience, and therefore no reason to manage his face into anything other than exactly what he feels. He came to call 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, because Sunday was the day when calling was appropriate, and he had no intention of conducting himself improperly. He brought nothing with him that could be construed as presumptuous, just himself and his bay horse, and the manners he had been raised with, which were the manners of a man who came from a family that had homesteaded in Kansas territory before it was Kansas at all, and had built what they built through work and decency, and a certain stubbornness that had passed from his father to him like a good tool passing through careful hands. The Holloway place was, as he had heard, 160 acres of good mixed-grass prairie, with a solid, squared-off claim house that her father had built when he had first taken the land, and a barn that was showing its age but was structurally sound, and a kitchen garden that was clearly being tended with serious attention. He could see the garden from the road before he reached the gate, neat rows of beans and squash and what looked like onions, and it told him something about the kind of care that was being applied to this place. Rodrigo was in the yard when Walter rode up, tending to a harness that he was mending with patient, practiced hands, and he looked up when Walter came through the gate and gave him another one of those precisely calibrated looks that contained a full assessment in its surface, and Walter bore it with the same steady patience he applied to everything. Rodrigo went to the door of the house and said something in Spanish too low for Walter to catch, and a moment later Della came out. She was in a plain gray dress today, not the blue calico of the fair, and her hair was down from its hat pins and pinned instead in a simple, clean arrangement at the back of her neck, and she was wiping her hands on a cloth that she had apparently brought from some task inside, and she looked exactly like a person who was not expecting him but was not surprised to see him either, which seemed about right. "Mr. Townsend," she said. "Miss Holloway," he said. "I hope I am not intruding." "You are not," she said, and there was enough of a pause between the words that he knew she had considered them, which he appreciated. "Come in and have some coffee." They sat at her kitchen table, which was a solid, plain piece of furniture that her father had clearly made himself, with the kind of square, honest construction that came from a man who had more intention than artistry, but did the job properly regardless. And they had coffee that was strong and good. And they talked again in the way they had talked at the fair, with the comfortable directness of two people who have already gotten through the surface of each other and are now exploring what lies underneath. She told him about her father, about Thomas Holloway, who had come out from Missouri in 1871, with nothing but a wagon and a compass, and the land grant that had come through the Homestead Act, and who had built everything she was now responsible for with his own hands, and a stubbornness that she had inherited in full. She spoke about him with a grief that was not raw anymore but was settled and real, the way grief becomes when you have been living with it for several months and have decided to carry it rather than be carried by it. Walter listened and did not offer platitudes, which was exactly right, and she noticed. He told her about his own father, who had died 5 years earlier, and his mother, who lived in the town of Dodge City now with his younger sister and her husband, and the way he had come to be alone on Townsend Flat, which was not a story of tragedy, but simply of the way life arranges itself when a man makes particular choices about where he wants to put down roots and what he wants to grow from them. By the time the coffee was done, 2 hours had passed, and the light through the kitchen window had shifted from its midday angle to the longer slant of the late afternoon. Rodrigo appeared once in the doorway, looked at both of them with eyes that were somewhat less conditional than they had been in the yard, and disappeared again. The young boy, whose name turned out to be Clem, and who was the son of one of the local farmers' families that Rodrigo had arranged to help on the property, could be heard doing something energetic outside with an implement that involved a considerable amount of clanging. "How are you managing the accounts?" Walter asked her, at a point in the conversation where it was natural to ask, not intrusively but from the genuine interest of a man who ran his own operation and understood the particular challenges of it. He asked the way a peer asks, not condescendingly but straightforwardly, because she was clearly a peer in every sense that mattered. She told him about the arrangement with the bank, and it was every bit as impressive as the version he had heard from Amos Gilchrist, perhaps more so because hearing it from her, in her own plain and unembellished telling, stripped away the admiring gloss that the story had acquired in its community retelling, and what was left was simply a woman who had sat down with a difficult problem and worked it through until she had found a way through it. He felt a deep and specific kind of respect rising in him, the kind that does not diminish into sentiment but stays clear and solid. "You are doing a remarkable thing," he said. She looked at him with the wariness she applied to compliments, which was a specific wariness that he was learning to recognize, the watchfulness of a person who has been told remarkable in a patronizing way enough times to be suspicious of the word. "I am doing what needs to be done," she said. "Yes," he said, "remarkably." And he said it so simply and levelly that it landed differently than the other times she had heard it, and she looked at him for a moment with something new in her expression, something that was surprised and careful and considering. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and by the 4th Sunday he was bringing things with him, practical things that had been thought out and were useful rather than decorative. The first time a proper bag of coffee because he had noticed that hers was running low, and she had accepted it without fuss because it was a sensible thing, and she was a sensible woman. And the second time a set of hinges for the barn door that had been sagging on its frame. And he had asked Rodrigo whether he minded if he took a look at it, and Rodrigo had held those hinges in his hands and then looked at Walter and given him a nod that contained rather more approval than the previous ones. He fixed the barn door that afternoon while Della and Rodrigo watched from the shade of the doorframe, and she brought him water when he was done, and their fingers touched briefly when she handed him the cup, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them needed to. Things between them deepened slowly and with deliberateness, because they were both people who moved that way, not from fear but from genuine care for the thing they were building. He came every Sunday and sometimes on a weekday evening when the long summer light allowed for it, and sometimes she rode over to his spread on the south tributary, which he showed her with the pride of a man showing someone something he loves and trusting them to see it clearly. She walked the fence lines with him and looked at the new shorthorns in their pasture and asked questions about his plans for the winter, and her eyes moved over his land with the evaluating intelligence of a woman who understood what a piece of ground could be made into if you worked it with intention. One evening in late September, when the air had the first true edge of autumn in it and the cottonwoods along the tributary were beginning their slow turn from green to gold, they were sitting on the wooden steps of his porch with the last of the day's light going orange on the horizon, and she said, out of what seemed like a quiet and comfortable silence, "I am glad you came to the fair." He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, at the orange light. "So am I," he said. "I heard you were the quietest bidder there," she said, and there was something in her voice that was the warmth she kept at the corners of her mouth, but wider now and more fully expressed. Jim Draper apparently mentioned it to half the county. "He mentioned it to the pen," Walter said, "which was enough." She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her full laugh, not the small contained laughter they had shared in conversation before, but a real one, bright and warm and entirely unguarded, and it went through him like the first good day of spring goes through a man who has been through a hard winter. He looked at her laughing in the September light and felt something settle into place in him, some tightly held thing that he had not fully known was tightly held until the moment it let go. "Della," he said. She looked at him, the laugh still in her eyes. "I think you know what I'm going to say," he said. "I might," she said. "Then I will say it anyway," he said, "because I am not the kind of man who doesn't say a thing when he ought to say it." He turned toward her on the porch step, and the orange light was full on his face, and he did not manage his expression at all, which for him was the most significant kind of offering. "I love you. I have been loving you since before I had a right to use that word, and I wanted you to know it." She was quiet for a moment, and the cottonwoods made their sound in the evening wind, and somewhere on the far side of the property one of the shorthorns called in the dusk. "I love you too," she said. "In case you were wondering." He was. He had been wondering with a considerable portion of his available mental energy for several weeks. "I'm glad you said it," he said. "I am too," she said. And then, with that directness that was entirely hers, she reached out and took his hand where it rested on the porch step and held it, and they sat there in the October coming evening, and neither of them needed to say anything else for quite some time. What followed was not without its complications, because life in Gray County, Kansas in 1882 was not a simple thing for anyone, and was particularly complicated for people who were trying to build something new while holding onto something they already had. The autumn was a dry one, and the winter that came behind it was severe in the particular way of Kansas winters, which do not commit to cold gradually, but arrive suddenly and fully, and with the conviction of something that has no interest in making itself comfortable for you. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was one of the harder ones that the region had seen in the decade since settlement had taken hold in Gray County. The temperatures dropped in December with a ferocity that cost several of the outlying homesteaders portions of their herds, and the snow that came in January was not the manageable kind, but the kind that drifted against fence lines and buried feed stores and required round-the-clock attention to keep the animals from coming to grief. Walter drove the 22 miles to Della's property when the worst of the January blizzard broke, 3 days after it had started, when the roads were passable again only because the wind had scoured some of them down to the frozen ground. He found Rodrigo and Clem and Della working themselves to the edge of exhaustion to clear out the cattle pen and get feed to the animals, and he put on his gloves and picked up a shovel and worked beside them for 8 hours without making a point of it. And by the end of the day, they had lost none of the herd, which was a better outcome than several of her neighbors had managed. That evening, warming up at the kitchen table with coffee that Della had made with the last of what was in the tin, he told her that he wanted to talk to her about something practical. She looked at him across the table with the clear-eyed patience of a woman who has been practical for so long that she is not alarmed by other people wanting to be practical. "Marry me," he said. She blinked, just once. Then she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever imagined hearing." "I know," he said, "but it's true. Marry me, Della, not because this is harder alone than together, though it is. Not because the winter is bad, and the land is demanding, though it is. But because I love you and I want to be your husband, and I want to know that you are here when I ride home and there when I wake up, and I want to help you keep this land because it is yours and it matters and so do you, more than anything else I can think of." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was warm with the stove's heat, and the wind was doing its Kansas thing against the windows, and Rodrigo was somewhere outside in the barn settling the animals for the night. And it was very quiet inside in the particular way that a kitchen can be quiet when two people in it are arriving at something that will not be undone. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she let him, and they sat there in the kitchen warmth with the winter going on outside and the world small and right-sized and entirely sufficient inside those four walls. They were married in March of 1883, when the land was still brown and winter flattened, but the first cautious hints of green were showing in the low places where water gathered. The ceremony was held in the small Methodist church in Cimarron, which was the right size for the occasion, because their circle of guests was not large but was deeply genuine. Amos Gilchrist came with his wife, who cried through the entire proceeding with the cheerful unabashedness of a woman who has been wanting something good to happen, and is relieved and delighted to see it. Rodrigo sat in the front pew in his best coat, and watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has decided that his approval of a situation is warranted. Walter's mother came down from Dodge City with his sister and her husband, making the journey on the railroad, and she embraced Della before the ceremony with the completeness of a woman who recognizes something important when she meets it. And Della embraced her back with a fullness that made Walter's throat do something inconvenient. The minister of the Cimarron Methodist Church, a man of 60 named Reverend Alcott, who had performed a great many marriages in his time, and had learned to read the difference between the ones that were conducted for convenience and the ones that were conducted from the deep and genuine thing, watched Walter Townsend look at Della Holloway throughout the ceremony with that complete and steady attention he gave to everything he loved. And he gave the blessing at the end with rather more sincerity than he usually managed. They combined the properties not immediately but thoughtfully over the course of the following year. This was not a simple thing. The Holloway land northeast of Cimarron and the Townsend land on the south tributary were not adjacent, which meant that combining them into a single operating entity required decisions about where they would make their primary home and how they would manage two separate parcels of land that were 20 miles apart. They talked about it the way they talked about everything, directly and with respect for each other's thinking, and they came to a plan that was practical and good. They would keep both properties. The Townsend flat on the south tributary would be the primary residence, because the house was larger and the water access was more reliable, but the Holloway land northeast of Cimarron would not be sold or leased away. Rodrigo would continue to manage the Holloway cattle on that land with the help of a second hired hand, a young man named Jonas Birch who had come looking for work in the spring and had turned out to be hardworking and trustworthy and exactly what the operation needed. The two herds would be managed as one enterprise, with Della overseeing the accounts and Walter overseeing the range management, and the arrangement would be one of genuine partnership in every sense of the word. What surprised Walter, in the first months of being married to Della Holloway, was not anything he would have told you was surprising if you had asked him to predict it beforehand. He had known she was capable. He had known she was direct and intelligent and entirely unafraid of work. What surprised him was how thoroughly, quietly, and completely she was herself in everything she did, at all times and in all weathers, which was something he had not quite fully understood until he saw it up close every single day. She did not diminish in proximity. She did not soften into something more accommodating or become a different version of herself in the business of being a wife. She was Della, fully and without apology, and she brought every bit of that Della-ness to bear on the life they were building together, and it made everything they built together better and more solid and more true. He told her this one morning in June, while they were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen at Townsend Flat, the windows open to the early summer air, the sound of the horses in the pasture coming in through the screen. She looked at him across the table with those dark eyes that he had learned to read with the intimate fluency that comes from months of careful attention, and she said, "You are the only man I have ever met who says that like it is a good thing." "It is the best thing," he said. She reached across the table and touched his face, briefly, and with a gentleness that she kept in a different register from the directness that ran everything else. And he turned his head and pressed his cheek into her palm for just a moment. And outside the summer went on being the summer, and the horses went on being the horses, and the world was exactly as it should be. The summer of 1883 brought new challenges and new pleasures in the way that summers on the Kansas prairie always do, never quite matching what you expected, and always somehow more than you had prepared for. The shorthorns Walter had bought at the Cimarron Fair the previous year were doing well, and the combined herd from both properties was shaping up into something that both he and Della could be genuinely proud of. The prices in the cattle market were holding, which was not always the case, and the railroad continued to make the business of getting beef to market more predictable than the old long drive days had allowed. There was a dry spell in July that worried them for 3 weeks, a stretch of cloudless days where the heat came down on the flat land like a pressing hand, and the creek levels dropped, and the pasture grass went the color of straw. Walter managed the water sources carefully, moving the cattle between the different parts of both properties so that no single pasture was overgrazed, and Della kept the books and tracked the water and hay reserves against their projected need with the meticulous attention that had convinced Chester Aldrich to give her a repayment plan in January. By August, the rains had come back and the grass had greened up, and the crisis had not become the disaster it might have been, and they celebrated this with a dinner at the kitchen table that Della made with what was available from the garden, which turned out to be more than enough. There was also, in that summer, a situation that required a kind of careful navigation. A man named Buford Tate, who owned a significant spread to the west of the Townsend property, had taken it into his head that the water rights along the south tributary were more complicated than they actually were, and had begun allowing his cattle to come over onto Walter's range in a way that was not accidental and was not acceptable. Walter handled this the way he handled disagreements generally, by going directly to Tate and having a clear, steady conversation about what was his and what was not, and what would happen if the situation continued. He was not threatening. He was simply clear, which is sometimes more effective than any threat, and Tate, who was a blustering man but not an essentially dishonest one, eventually backed down and kept his cattle on his own side of the line. Della asked him about it when he came home that evening, because she had noticed the Tate cattle on their range and had already begun looking into the water rights documents herself to see what their legal position was. He told her about the conversation, and she listened, and then she showed him what she had found in the documents, which confirmed everything he had said to Tate, and a few additional things that would have been useful if the situation had escalated. They both looked at the documents together at the kitchen table, and he looked at her and said, "You were already 3 steps ahead of me. I was going to ride over there myself if you had not come home when you did," she said, without particular drama. "I know," he said, and he said it with a quality of admiration that she had by now learned to accept without deflecting. That autumn, in October of 1883, Della told Walter that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning before breakfast, when the light was new and the house was quiet, and she told him plainly and clearly in the way she told him everything, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the window, and she watched his face as she said it with the focused attention of a woman who is waiting to see what she has been hoping to see. What she saw was Walter Townsend, who was generally the most composed man she had ever encountered, show every single feeling that was moving through him in the space of about 5 seconds with no attempt whatsoever to manage any of them. She saw the surprise and then the joy and then the depth of something that did not have a simple word attached to it, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, carefully and completely, with his face pressed into her hair and his arms around her like something that intended to stay. "All right," she said against his shoulder. "You need to breathe." "I am breathing," he said. "You really are not," she said. He breathed. She could feel him do it, a long, slow intake and exhale against her hair, and then he held her at arm's length and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, steady and full and entirely without reservation, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling completely well," she said. "I am not fragile, Walter." "I know," he said. "I know you are not, I just need to ask." "Then yes," she said. "I am well. We are well." And she held his gaze steadily, and he held hers, and the morning light came in through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them like something given and received. Their son was born in June of 1884, in the bedroom at Townsend Flat, with the help of Mrs. Carver, the midwife from Cimarron, who made the drive out with her bag and her calm competence, and managed the whole proceeding with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had brought a great many babies into the world and had no patience with panic. Walter spent the hours of Della's labor doing what he could, which was not much in the practical sense, but was a great deal in the sense of being present and steady, and available to hold her hand when she wanted it held, and to stay out of the way when Mrs. Carver told him to stay out of the way, which he did with perfect compliance. The boy came into the world at sunrise, and the first thing Walter Townsend did when Mrs. Carver placed his son in his arms was to stand very still in the bedroom light and look at him with the same complete, steady attention he gave to everything that mattered most. "He looks like you," Della said from the bed, tired and clear-eyed and watching him. "God help him," Walter said. She laughed, which made Mrs. Carver look up from her work with a satisfied nod, because a woman who could laugh was a woman who was going to be all right. They named him Thomas, after her father. Walter had suggested it, and she had looked at him with an expression that he would not have been able to describe to someone who had not seen it, but which said everything that needed to be said, and she had taken his hand and said, "Yes, Thomas." Thomas Townsend grew in the way that healthy children in good homes grow, steadily, and with the particular completeness of a child who is both wanted and surrounded. Rodrigo came to see him in the first week and stood over the cradle with an expression of dignified approval, and said something in Spanish that Walter's limited command of the language did not fully catch, but the sentiment of which was entirely clear. Amos Gilchrist's wife brought a blanket she had quilted herself and cried again, which was entirely consistent with her established pattern at significant occasions in their lives. Walter's mother came down from Dodge City on the train in July to meet her grandson, and she sat in the rocking chair in the bedroom at Townsend Flat and held Thomas against her chest and told Della, with the directness of a woman who had raised a son capable of loving the way Walter loved, that she had been hoping for someone exactly like her. The years that followed built themselves one upon the other with the particular quality of good years, not without difficulty, because the land and the weather and the market were never fully predictable, and not without loss, because life does not maintain exemption from loss simply because you are trying to live it well, but good years nonetheless, years that had the right weight and the right texture. Years that, when you looked back on them from a distance, had the quality of being exactly what they were supposed to be. There was a drought in 1885 that was the worst Gray County had seen since settlement, a dry summer that followed a dry spring and showed no sign of relenting into autumn, and they had to make hard decisions about the herd, selling off portions of it at reduced prices rather than risk losing them to insufficient feed and water. It was the kind of decision that hurt in the specific way that financial loss hurts, when you have built something carefully, and now have to sacrifice part of it to protect the rest. Walter and Della made the decision together at the kitchen table with the books open between them and the numbers laid out plainly, and it was Della who drew the final line under the final figure and said, "This is what we do. We keep the breeding stock and we sell the rest, and we come back from this next year." They did come back. The rains returned in late September of 1885, tentative at first, and then with the generosity of something that had been holding back and now released. And the grass came back, and the water came back, and the herd they had protected through the drought was sound and strong. And the following spring they rebuilt in exactly the direction they had planned. By 1886, the Townsend operation was one of the more solid and well-regarded ranching enterprises in Gray County. Not the largest, but known for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its management, and the particular fact that its books were always in order and its debts were always settled, which was Della's doing as much as Walter's, and which both of them knew and neither of them felt any need to establish credit over. The injustices of the time did not pass them by entirely, because they could not pass anyone entirely by in that era. The Indian Territory to the south was being compressed further and further as the government pushed the Comanche and Kiowa and other nations off land that had been theirs in ways that Walter and Della both found deeply troubling when they thought about it honestly, and they tried to think about it honestly. They knew the families of some of the Arapaho people who had been pushed north through Gray County in the early years of settlement. And when a pair of those families camped along the tributary creek in the winter of 1885 on their way further north, Walter brought feed and Della brought food, quietly and without ceremony, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and neither of them felt any need to make a performance of it. It did not solve the larger wrong, and they both knew that. And sometimes in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked about what it meant to be building something on a piece of land that had been someone else's ground before the law had made it theirs to homestead. And there were no clean answers to that conversation, just the commitment to see it clearly and to conduct themselves in their particular corner of the world with as much decency as the world allowed. Rodrigo remained at the Holloway land on the North Range until 1886, when his health began to decline in the way of old men who have been giving everything they had to outdoor physical work for 40 years, and whose bodies finally present a bill for the investment. He was perhaps 65, though he had never been entirely certain of his own age, and the joints that had served him faithfully through decades of hard work were telling him now in unmistakable terms that the terms were changing. Della went to see him at the Holloway house, where he was living in the small room off the barn that he had occupied for as long as anyone remembered, and she sat with him in the afternoon and talked for a long time. She came home to Walter that evening and told him what she wanted to do, which was to build a proper room onto the back of the main house at Townsend Flat and move Rodrigo there, where he could live with them without the burden of managing the work he could no longer manage. Walter had been expecting some version of this conversation since the previous autumn when Rodrigo's health had first begun to show its changes, and he had already thought about what a room addition would require and where the materials could be sourced. "Yes," he said, "we'll start on it next week." She looked at him with those dark eyes that still, after 3 years of marriage, could carry more into a look than most people could say in a paragraph. "You had already planned it," she said. "I thought you would probably want to," he said. "You know me very well," she said. "I intend to keep at it," he said. Rodrigo moved into the room at Townsend Flat in October of 1886, and he lived there for 4 more years, in reasonable comfort, and with the dignity that he had earned many times over. And he watched young Thomas grow into a boy who was serious and curious, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's particular quality of steady attention. And sometimes in the evenings, Rodrigo told Thomas stories in a mixture of Spanish and English about the earlier days, the days before the homesteads, when the land had been something different, and Thomas listened with wide-eyed intensity, and Walter and Della listened from the doorway and said nothing, because some things are better received without comment. In the spring of 1887, Della discovered she was expecting again. She told Walter with the same directness she had employed the first time, in the morning light, in the kitchen, and this time he managed to breathe throughout the entire conversation, which she counted as growth. Their second child, a daughter they named Frances, arrived in November of 1887, red-faced and opinionated about the whole business of being born, and Thomas, who was 3 years old and had been prepared for the event with considerable care, looked at his new sister with the grave, assessing attention he had clearly inherited directly from his father and said, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Della told him. "Good," Thomas said, with the air of a man who has made a decision about something and is satisfied with where it has landed. Frances Townsend did get bigger, and she did so with considerable enthusiasm and a personality that was not precisely like either of her parents, but contained the best qualities of both, the directness and the steadiness, and also something that was entirely its own, a brightness that came into a room before she did and stayed after she left, a quality that made Amos Gilchrist's wife declare, on the occasion of Frances's first birthday, that this child was going to give the county something to think about. Rodrigo passed in the winter of 1890, quietly and in his sleep, in the room at the back of Townsend flat that had been built for him, on a night when the stars were very clear, and the cold was the sharp, clean kind that smells like nothing at all. Walter found him in the morning and sat with him for a while before calling anyone, and Della came in and sat beside Walter, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was a fullness rather than an absence. They buried Rodrigo on the north rise of the Holloway land, because that was where he had worked the longest and where the grass was best in the spring, and Jonas Birch, who had managed that land for the past several years and had come to know Rodrigo as well as anyone could, helped dig the grave and stood through the brief ceremony with his hat against his chest, and his face set in the expression of a man honoring a man he respected. The Holloway land continued to function as part of the larger Townsend operation, and by 1890, the combined enterprise had grown to something that Walter's younger self, standing at a fence rail in the dawn quiet of Townsend Flat in the earliest days, would have found remarkable. They had 320 acres of operating range, a herd of 80 head of quality beef cattle, and 12 shorthorn breeding cows that had become the particular pride of the operation, a reputation in the county that had been built on consistency and honesty, and a set of books that were the cleanest and most accurate in Gray County by the assessment of anyone who had occasion to look at them. Walter Townsend was 40 years old in the summer of 1891, and he stood on the porch of Townsend Flat on an August evening, with the sun going down over the flat Kansas horizon in the particular way. It went down on the prairie, in extravagant color that seemed too generous for a day that had been entirely ordinary, and he looked at what he had built and what was his, and the sum of it was more than the land and the cattle and the well-made fences. The sum of it was Thomas, who was 7 years old and had begun accompanying his father on the morning rounds with the serious, attentive purpose of a boy who was learning what it meant to be responsible for something. The sum of it was Frances, who was 3 and ran the household with small, determined hands and a conversational power that could bring any adult in the vicinity to a respectful halt. The sum of it was the room at the back of the house that was empty now but not cold, because the presence of the man who had occupied it was still felt in the particular way that the presences of good people continue to be felt. And the sum of it was Della, who came out onto the porch then with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the bench that he had built that spring, replacing the worn-out one that had served the porch since before she had come to live here, and she handed him the coffee and looked at the same horizon he was looking at and said nothing for a while because nothing needed to be said. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, eventually. "The fair," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes, which had the same quality at 35 that they had had at 26, the same direct intelligence and now also the layered knowledge of years, the understanding that comes from having seen someone in all the lights and all the weathers, from having been known by them and having known them in return, from having built something together that did not exist before you put your hands to it. "Which part?" she said. "All of it," he said. "The gray mule, the cornbread. Jim Draper calling me the quiet man in the tobacco hat." She smiled. The full smile, not the corner thing but the real one that had taken him months to earn and that he still thought was the best thing he had ever seen. "You are still the quietest man I know," she said. "I had something worth being quiet for," he said. She looked at him with the expression he had seen on that porch step in September of 1882, when he had told her he loved her, and she had told him she loved him back. And then she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch bench. He had built that spring and watched the Kansas sky do what it did at the end of a good day, which was to put everything it had left into the going down. All the color and the light and the particular gold that the prairie grass catches at the last moment before dark comes on. Thomas came to the porch door and opened it and stood there, 7 years old and serious, and said, Frances knocked over the milk pitcher. "How much milk was in it?" Della asked without moving from her husband's shoulder. "A lot," Thomas said. "Go help her clean it up," Della said. "I will come in a moment." Thomas considered this and then nodded with the gravity of a child accepting a reasonable arrangement and went back inside. They heard the sounds of the cleanup beginning, and Frances's bright, carrying voice explaining something at length about what had happened and why. And Walter and Della looked at each other, and the evening light was in her eyes, and she was laughing silently, with the fullness he had first heard at the fair that September. And he was laughing too, and the prairie went on going about its business around them, steady and enormous and entirely indifferent to the specific happiness of two people on a porch, which was fine, because they did not need it to notice. They needed only each other, and the coffee and the evening and the sound of their children inside the house they had made together, and they had all of those things in abundance. The years continued in the way of years that are being well used, not without labor and not without grief, but with the particular solidity of something that has been built on honest foundations and tended with genuine care. The drought of 1893 was difficult, and the cattle market that year took a turn that cost them, but they had weathered harder things, and they moved through this one with the same steady methodology, adjusting and protecting and planning for the return. The return came, as it had before. Thomas grew into a tall, quiet boy who at 10 was helping Jonah's birch on the North Range, and at 12 could read a cattle's condition as well as any man his father knew, which Walter told him with a plainness that made the compliment land squarely and without embellishment, which was exactly the way his son needed to hear it. Frances grew into a girl who was, as Amos Gilchrist's wife had predicted, giving the county something to think about, with a sharpness and a warmth and a particular capacity for friendship that brought people to her the way good water brings animals across open ground. Walter's mother died in the spring of 1894, in Dodge City, peacefully and at a considerable age, and they made the journey north on the train, all 4 of them, for the funeral. It was the first time Thomas and Frances had been on a train, and they sat at the window and watched the Kansas plains go by with expressions that Walter recognized as the same expression he had worn when he had first truly understood the size of the land he was going to spend his life on, that particular mixture of smallness and wonder that is the honest response to something enormous being shown to you. He sat beside Della on the train and held her hand, and she held his, and outside the prairie went by in the April light, green now after the long brown winter, and the sky was that particular Kansas blue that has no equivalent anywhere else, deep and clear and going all the way to whatever was on the other side of it. By 1895, Townsend Flat was something that people in Gray County pointed to when they were talking about what a well-run Kansas ranch operation looked like. This was not only about the cattle or the land, though both were in excellent condition. It was about the way the whole enterprise was managed, which was with a combination of practical intelligence and genuine care that made everything about it work better than things that are managed for profit alone. Walter handled the range and the stock with the patient, thoughtful attention he brought to everything. Della handled the accounts and the planning and the negotiations, which she had always been better at than anyone, and which she conducted with a directness that people had long since stopped being surprised by because they had seen enough times what it produced. Jonas Birch had become, over the years, something more than a hired hand. He was 32 now, had been with the operation since 1884, and was as much a part of the working of both properties as anyone. He had married a woman named Pearl 2 years earlier, and they lived in the small house on the Holloway land that Rodrigo had once occupied, which had been rebuilt and added to for the occasion, and Pearl had started a kitchen garden there that was, by common agreement, the finest kitchen garden in the northern part of the county. There were evenings when Jonas and Pearl came to supper at Townsend Flat, and the table was full of the particular good noise of people who know each other well and have things to say to each other, and are comfortable enough in the knowing to say them. And Thomas and Francis were part of this in the way that children who have been raised among adults who respect them are part of it, as participants rather than presences to be managed. And the table was loud and warm, and full of the laughter that comes when people are genuinely glad to be where they are. One evening in the autumn of 1895, when the children were in bed and Jonas and Pearl had gone home, and the house was quiet in the warm, settled way of an evening fully spent, Walter and Della sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the account books open, working through the quarter-end figures the way they did every 3 months, side by side rather than across from each other, so that they could both see the same numbers. Della was making notations in her careful, precise hand, and Walter was reading the figures she pointed to and offering the context from the range records, and they worked like this for an hour in a comfortable near silence that was the distillation of everything they had built between them, the ability to be 2 separate people in one working unit at the same time. She looked up at some point and found him looking at her, not at the books. She raised an eyebrow. "I was thinking," he said, "about the figures." "No," he said, she waited. "About the fair," he said, for the second time in the years they had been together, and she knew immediately which fair and which morning and which particular hour of the morning he meant, because there was only one fair in their accounting that had the particular weight this one had. "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't gone," he said. "If I had decided the Shorthorns could wait, if I had stayed home." She looked at him with the deep, layered knowledge of 13 years of knowing him in all the ways that you come to know a person when you have built a life with them, through drought and prosperity and grief and ordinary days that were the actual substance of everything. "You would have gone eventually," she said. "You are not a man who leaves things undone that matter." "I might have waited too long," he said. "Then it is fortunate that you did not," she said. He reached across the account books and took her hand, the same hand he had held on that September porch step in 1882, the same hand he had held on the train to Dodge City, the same hand that had made the notations in the account books that had kept this operation sound through good years and hard ones, and he held it in both of his, and looked at her in the lamplight with the complete, unmanaged steadiness of a man who has nothing left to hide and no reason to want to. "I am very glad I went to that fair," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes, still dark, still direct, still carrying everything he had come to know and love in them, and the lamp between them made the room small and warm and exactly sufficient, and outside the October night was doing what October nights on the Kansas prairie do, cooling toward the stars and the enormous quiet of the flat country. And inside this kitchen, at this table, with these books and this lamp and these hands held together, was everything that either of them had wanted when they wanted it most clearly. "So am I," she said, and she was. She had known it from the moment she had looked across the auction pen and seen a man in a tobacco-colored hat standing at the rail in complete and quiet stillness while everything moved around him, and had felt the pull of that stillness like a compass finding north, a feeling she had not had a name for then, but had spent the years since filling in with everything that had come after. The name for it was simply this man. This particular man, who had driven 22 miles before sunrise to bid on cattle, he did not strictly need, and had stood at a fence rail and watched her steers sell, and had told her about a gray mule, and had walked with her in the afternoon light, and come back every Sunday and fixed the barn door and sat in her kitchen, and proposed to her in the most practical and honest and entirely perfect way imaginable. Thomas came into the kitchen for a glass of water, as children do when they are supposed to be asleep and are not quite, and found his parents sitting at the kitchen table holding hands over the account books, which was not an unusual thing to find, and which he registered with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has seen this particular arrangement his entire life and considers it simply the way things are. He got his water, said good night, and padded back to bed, and the kitchen was quiet again, and the lamp burned between them, and the accounts were not going anywhere, and they stayed there a while longer at the table with their hands together before the practical necessities of the next morning called them back to the full and good and ordinary reality of the life they had built. It was a life that had begun with a quiet bid at a livestock fair, a man who had driven 22 miles before sunrise for reasons he could only partly explain to his account book, and a woman who had looked up from her steers and across a pen and into the steady gray-green eyes of the quietest bidder in the crowd, and had felt, without quite knowing why, that something was about to begin. It had been a beginning worth every mile of the drive, worth every early morning and difficult winter and dry summer and hard decision, made at kitchen tables in lamplight and ordinary evenings on porch benches, watching the prairie sky do its extravagant, generous thing at the close of each day. Worth all of it, every single piece of it, right down to the 2 sleeping children in the back rooms and the account book spread open on the table, and the lamp burning between them and the hands held steady and the whole of Gray County going quiet outside under the October stars. Worth everything, all of it, every single bit.